Hey guys, it's Dr. Ben back for part 2 of our stress series. So in part 1, we talked about a general overview of stress, what is it, good and the bad, and the effects that good and bad stress have on us. Today we're going to get into the physiology of the stress response, kind of how it occurs. The first place we need to start is looking at the impact of the nervous system and the endocrine system on our stress response, because those are ultimately the two that create the response. And we have to look at this pathway called the HPA axis. So the HPA axis stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It is the primary driver of the stress response. It activates whenever we encounter stress, and it works to return our body back to balance or homeostasis after experiencing the stress. So the first place we have to kind of look with that is when we encounter stress, our brain sends a signal down to the hypothalamus, which releases a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone or corticotropin releasing factor, which goes downstream to activate our pituitary gland to release a hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which then gets in our bloodstream, travels down to just above our kidneys where our adrenal glands sit. Adrenal means above the kidneys, so they sit right on top, to stimulate the release of cortisol, epinephrine and norepinephrine, our stress hormones. In this case, we're going to talk more about cortisol. So cortisol itself, and by the way, once we get that cortisol release, we actually get a little bit of that cortisol that it travels back upstream to our hypothalamus and our pituitary gland to either tell those structures to release more of their hormones to cause more release of cortisol from our adrenal glands to handle more stress, or less to calm the stress response down. Now, when we look at cortisol, it's a steroid hormone, okay? It's part of a larger class of compounds called glucocorticoids. And it's ultimately the end goal of that HPA axis activation. We just want to stimulate the release of that. So cortisol does a few things. It helps to prime our fight or flight response, get us ready to fight or flee from a stressful or dangerous situation. It helps to raise our blood sugar. It actually stimulates the release of glucagon, and glucagon helps to push glucose back into our bloodstream. It helps to balance our electrolytes out. It helps to reduce inflammation, and by also reducing or lowering immune function. So one of the other things it does is it helps to modulate memory, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, and then it helps to regulate your sleep. It and melatonin work hand in hand to kind of create our sleep-wake cycle. So there are two important premises that we need to talk about when it comes to the stress response and cortisol release. We have this premise called physiological resilience, which is basically the capacity of cells or organs to withstand changes on a daily basis. So this is necessary for the body to function in any manner, like arteries' ability to dilate when blood flow increases, clearing excess glucose out of your bloodstream after eating, an increase and decrease in cortisol when faced with stress. So that's a short-term answer. Then we have this premise called metabolic reserve. So with metabolic reserve, we look more at the ability of the cells and organs to withstand repeated changes to the physiological need over an extended period of time. Now, more of an example of this, as opposed to the short term and the long term, it'd be like with type 2 diabetes, we start to see the breakdown of beta cells, which release insulin. So the more stress we put on that system, the more it breaks down those beta cells, and the worse the diabetes becomes. So over time, we see our ability to adapt to stress can change quite a bit based on these two factors. So in the short term, the more efficient your physiological resilience is, the more efficient your stress response is. In the long term, it's basically the more stress you can handle over a long period of time. And there are different disruptors to these HPA axis and to cortisol release. When we look at, so one, for instance, is perceived stress. So this is the most obvious stress, and this is the mental and emotional triggers that we typically recognize, and the things that we perceive that stress us out, that may cause anxiety or agitation or those type of things. As we discussed a few minutes ago, blood sugar imbalances. So one of cortisol's main duties is to help regulate blood sugar. If we're skipping meals or we're eating a lot of, high sugar, high processed foods, it's going to create a roller coaster with our blood sugar. And, for the most part, we may be able to handle that. Our bodies may be able to handle that. But when you have instances where, you may have some hypoglycemic issues, or on the flip side of that, maybe some insulin resistance, it puts a lot more stress on our body, thus demanding more of a stress response. Lack of sleep. So as I said a minute ago, cortisol, along with melatonin, helps to regulate our sleep-wake cycle, our circadian rhythm. Cortisol wakes us up, and melatonin helps to put us to sleep, and they work inversely of each other. So what should normally happen is when you wake up, your cortisol should be around its highest, and as we go through the day, and your melatonin should be at its lowest. And as we go throughout the day, those should change. Your cortisol should steadily lower, and your melatonin should steadily raise until when we go to bed, melatonin's at its highest, cortisol's at its lowest. If we have a, poor sleep-wake cycle because we stay up all night, or we don't get enough sleep in general, or we, work an odd shift, that rhythm and our ability to regulate that rhythm can become impaired. It's a very, very carefully measured and controlled system, and you're trying to basically bust that rhythm up by pushing more cortisol in when it doesn't normally need to be there, or less when it normally needs to be there. So one of the other things that can disrupt that axis is inflammation. So inflammation is not something that's normally talked about, but there's a lot of avenues for creating excess general inflammation, systemic inflammation in the body. Another one of cortisol's main functions is to reduce that. So if we've got chronic inflammation from overtraining or not recovering properly from athletic performance, you're going to create poor adaptation. You're going to have an abnormal stress response because your body's going to still be in a perceived stress state. Inflammation, even from overgrowths of pathogenic bacteria in your gut, can actually create excess stress on the body and create excess cortisol release. So there are a lot of factors there that can create inflammation. And the stress response itself is very indiscriminate. It's very black or white. Either you need to handle a stressor or you don't. It doesn't matter what the stressor is. It doesn't matter if you get into a fight with a spouse or a loved one. You see that you're short of money you thought you had, or you're out in the woods and you have to run from a bear or fight a bear. The exact same process happens. You go through that HPA axis and it handles the stressor. So it really comes down to our ability to adapt to stress more than anything. The better that HPA axis is at functioning from brain down, the more efficient and effective your stress response is going to be. Which brings up one last thing that we really need to talk about, and it's this idea. It's been very, very overly popularized in kind of the alternative healthcare world, and that's this idea of adrenal fatigue. So I'll just be honest with you. Adrenal fatigue, there's no literature to support it. If you look on PubMed, there's no studies showing that adrenal fatigue is a real thing. If you don't know what adrenal fatigue is, adrenal fatigue is basically the idea that you push your stress system so much that you fatigue your adrenal glands out to where they can't produce cortisol, or they produce too much cortisol or something like that. Well, I mean, that is a thing. It's actually a pathological disease. Adrenal insufficiency is called Addison's disease. It's an autoimmune condition where you start breaking down the adrenal glands. That's different than what adrenal fatigue is presented as. So what we normally want to look at instead is that HPA axis dysfunction. If you look that up in literature, that's real. We either start perceiving too much stress, or not adapting to the stress properly. Again, it's all about adaptation. So looking at us running out of cortisol, I mean, it happens, but it's an actual disorder, a condition, a disease. It's not something that happens to everybody, like is usually pushed by a lot of these online gurus and things like that. So when we talk about it, we really want to talk about the inability to adapt to stress rather than running out of gas. Now, in the next part of our series, part 3, so we've kind of talked about the ins and outs of stress and what can happen when it goes wrong. We need to talk about how to start stepping back on that stuff, how to make our systems more efficient at adapting to that stress, how to calm an abnormal or exaggerated stress response. We need to, if we're in a constant fight or flight state, we need to learn how to pull ourselves out of it. All right, guys. Well, I can't wait to do part 3. We'll talk a bit more in another week. See ya.